Yay! All right, beautiful. Hello, and welcome to Introduction to Logic. I'm Nathan Wildman. I'm in the philosophy department here at Tilburg University. I really love my job. This is such a fun class to teach. So I'm very, very happy to have you guys here and to be able to talk about this stuff with you. So what are we going to do this morning? Well, first, we're going to get my clicker to work, if it will. Yes. So here's the rough and ready plan. I'm going to start off by telling you a little bit about what logic is, or at least as I'm going to be talking about it, and give you something like a sales pitch for the course. That's not going to take too terribly long, but we'll sort of see how it goes. Along the way, I'm going to introduce to you the kind of key concept that pretty much everything we're going to be talking about comes back to. And spoilers, this is going to be the notion of validity. I don't know if people have heard of it, but that's what we're really going to be after. So that's going to be, let's call it the first half an hour, 40 minutes maybe. Then I'm going to do some stuff about kind of background notions. So just kind of distinguishing some simplifying assumptions we're going to run with throughout the course. And then finally, right at the very end, we're going to start in on learning our first formal language. And this is going to be truth functional logic, or TFL. So that's the plan for this morning. I should say I'm not going to spend any time talking about the pragmatics because we put the sort of lecture 0 video up on the page. Did everybody get a chance to see that? Like, it's got all of this stuff about how the assessment for the course will go, the broad structure of what topics we'll cover, things like this. I want to kind of hit the ground running and just talk about stuff today. Make sense? One thing that is worth saying before we launch in directly is about how to run this. So obviously along the way, feel free to raise your hand, ask questions, things like this. Keep it on topic, you know. We had somebody last year ask me about like the moon landing being fake. That was less helpful. So really, yeah, just kind of keep it on topic, but I'm very happy to answer questions. Obviously, though, this is not the ideal situation for it because of the number of people, and more importantly in this case, the structure of the room. Thank God nobody sat all the way over there, otherwise I'd be really just like panopticon kind of swiveling here. One thing we do have is tutorials for this course. There's weekly tutorials. This is really where, to be honest, most of the work for this course is going to be done. Because, spoilers, guys, this is somewhere in between a maths class and a foreign language class. Because I'm basically going to be teaching you a weird foreign maths language. Yay! It's super cool. So, let's start off by talking about what logic is and my sales pitch for why studying it. So here's the first thing. Arguments. We're all about arguments, or I'm all about arguments, in unfortunately many different senses. Now, notably, argument is frequently used in common vernacular for something like the top picture there, where really that's just a kind of fight, right? Think about your most recent argument with family members or significant others or whoever you like. That's not the sort of thing that's really interesting to me. What's interesting to me in terms of an argument is something more like what I've got in the bottom here. Right? So we have some sentences in a sort of structure. And this is my dog, Mira. Mira is amazing and lovely, and I will hear nothing bad about her. So the argument about Mira is Mira's a dog. All dogs are canines. And then there's this thing at the end that says, therefore, Mira's a canine. Shock, horror, we all just learned something deep and amazing. This is the kind of thing that we're going to be studying. We're going to be looking at arguments. And to give you some more sort of ideas here, arguments can be broken down in constituent parts. So we have at the top here 1 and 2, which we'll call premises. These are the sorts of reasons that we're putting forward for 3, which is our conclusion. Right? So 1 and 2 are supposed to give you motivation for buying, accepting, taking as true. 3. Again, none of this, I hope, is terribly surprising. You've seen stuff like this before. So just to give you our first definition, we'll say an argument is any collection of premises together with a conclusion. A little pragmatic tip here, if you're going back through the slides studying later, every definition will be in a blue box like this. So these are the sorts of things that will be helpful later when we get down to midterms and final exams, stuff like that. So an argument is any collection of premises together with a conclusion. So maybe a fun little question here. Like, what's the minimum number of premises we need for an argument?
1.
I like it. Can anybody give me lower? We could go with 0. Like, we could just have a conclusion. We could just have a conclusion that's so obvious that it doesn't need any justification. We'll talk more about this kind of idea in the second half of the course. But any collection includes the null collection. Already get to see some of the fun stuff here. So, an argument's any collection of premises together with a conclusion. Philosophers, actually people in general, are argumentation machines. You input food, coffee, in my case, far too much beer, and we will output arguments. Again, sometimes in that first sense, too. But of course, right, not all arguments are created equal. Some are good, and some are bad. So how do we sort the good from the bad? How do we tell when an argument's good or when an argument's bad? Well, here's an intuitive thought. We'll say that, hey, if you believe the premises, if you buy the premises, then a good argument gives you a reason to also believe the conclusion. Or put another way, right, a good argument lets you derive the conclusion from the premises. Now, of course, what the hell does derive mean? And what does, right, give you reason to believe that mean? This is stuff we're going to unpack shortly. But this is kind of an intuitive idea, right? So a good argument basically is one where, hey, the premises, the reasons, somehow motivate, get you to the conclusion. So cool, if that's a good argument, what's a bad argument? Well, a bad argument is one that doesn't do that. But that's a little flat-footed. So we can think about multiple ways an argument might turn out to be bad. And there's at least 2. One way we can talk about is the way of content. And this is when one or more of the premises is false. So if it turns out that I was lying to you, right? Mira isn't a dog. Mira is, in fact, a very cleverly disguised fox. Right? The arguments I gave you earlier would have been bad because premise 1 was false. So let's think a little bit more about this first way, this way of content, right? One or more of the premises is false. So here's another argument. This is a 3-premise argument. We've got Mira's a sausage. Mira's not cute. All non-cute sausages are felines. Conclusion, Mira's a feline. All of the premises are false here. Mira is obviously not a sausage. Mira is clearly fucking cute. Anyone who says otherwise is a moron, right? And it's not the case that all non-cute sausages are felines. So 1, 2, and 3 are false. So there's a sense in which this is a very bad argument. The premises are false. So they don't give us a reason to accept the conclusion. Cool. So that's one of the 2 ways that an argument can be bad. Everybody kind of get that idea? We see the notion there? Now I'm going to go back a slide. Now my second way, went too far. Second way here, the bad way, is the way of form. And this is where the conclusion doesn't really follow from the premises. And I really should have put follow from here in that sort of scare quotes, right? But let's try and get a grip on that. So, let's try and cash out this way of form. What does it mean for a conclusion to follow from the premises? This is a little tricky. And here we're going to hit our first real substantive notion. But here's the intuitive thought. we'll say that the conclusion follows from the premises, provided that were the premises all true, the conclusion would be too. That is, the truth of the premises guarantees the truth of the conclusion. We kind of get the intuitive idea there, right? If we switch on all the premises, then it's going to guarantee that the conclusion's also switched on too. Makes sense. Makes sense. Again, kind of capturing this idea of something like follows from. So we can define this up in slightly more technical terms. We'll introduce the notion of validity. Say an argument is valid if and only if it's impossible for all of its premises to be true and the conclusion false. Now I'm going to tell you right now, know this, love this, write this in your heart. The definition of validity will be the first question on the midterm and the first question on the final exam. This is the thing that we as logicians are interested in. All the rest is window dressing. This is the core notion. Validity is very important. It's capturing this idea of the conclusion somehow following from, falling out of the conclusion, or sorry, the premises. But some things to note. Validity isn't interested in the actual truth of the premises. It's only interested in what happens, whether it's possible for the premises to be true and the conclusion false. Isn't it? It's a subtle kind of thing, but it's very important here. We don't really care whether the premises are actually true. We just want to know, hey, is it even possible for us to make them true and still have the conclusion false? If that's possible, the argument is not valid. It's bad in the way of form. How we feel about validity. Make sense? Give or take? Let's run through some arguments, see how it goes. Let me add, before we talk about these arguments, something very careful and important about the notion of validity. It only applies to arguments. We do not say that premises are valid. We do not say conclusions are valid. Validity is a property of arguments. Similarly, we don't talk about arguments being true or false. That's something that sentences have. Premises can be true or false. Conclusions can be true or false. Arguments do not take that property. They are valid or invalid. Okay, so everybody got the definition? Again, know it, love it, write it in your hearts. So here's our earlier argument. We know this was bad in the way of content, right? All the premises are false. Okay? Is it valid? What do you think? Valid? Invalid? 50-50 chance. Valid? Invalid? It's valid. It's valid. So let's think about it. Why is it valid? The definition of validity says that an argument's valid if and only if it's impossible for all the premises to be true and the conclusion false. So, can we make these premises true and the conclusion false? No, right? If 1, 2, and 3 are true, the truth of 4 is guaranteed. So this argument's valid, even though the premises are all false. Do we see the line here? Cool. So we've already learned something again. Right? The actual truth or falsity of these premises don't matter. What matters is whether it's possible to make the premises true and the conclusion false. If we can do that at all, invalid. If we can't do that, validity is achieved. So there's our first one. This argument's valid. If the 3 premises were true, conclusion would be 2. Okay, so far. Let's do another one. 2-premise argument this time. Premise 1, Tilburg is in the Netherlands. Premise 2, Nathan is human. Conclusion, therefore, Willems Twee is based in Tilburg. Valid, invalid. Invalid. Why is it invalid? I like the thought. So we had this idea, right? There's no kind of connection between the premises and the conclusion. That's a fair point. But that's not actually why this is invalid. So this argument's invalid because it's possible to make the premises true and the conclusion false. Right? Now, I think what you were suggesting is an explanation for why that's possible. But remember the definition of validity. An argument's valid if and only if it's impossible for all the premises to be true and the conclusion false. Can we think of a scenario where 1 and 2 are true, but 3 is false?
Yeah, didn't say it wasn't based in Tilburg.
Yeah.
That could still mean that the other 2 are true.
Absolutely, right? Let's imagine a scenario where, right, Tilburg is still in the Netherlands, I'm still human, but the financial crisis combined with the corona crisis made Willems Twee have to fold. So the team's no longer around. Cool. 1 and 2 would be true, and 3 false. Or, this destroying me, maybe Willems Twee moves to Breda. That would be impossible in some senses, but not really impossible. So again, there's plenty of cases where we can get 1 and 2 true, but 3 false. So this argument is invalid. And this is despite the fact that 1 and 2 are actually true. In fact, 1, 2, and 3 are all true. What matters is that there's a possible scenario. We can make it such that 1 and 2 are on, but 3 is off. Cool so far? How are we feeling about validity? Kind of getting it? And we've been talking about it for like 3 minutes, so it's cool if we don't have it quite yet. We ready for the hard one, the fun one? This is my favorite one. This comes back so much. Okay. Last argument I want to talk about with regards to validity. Okay, 2-premise argument. Premise 1, Mars has exactly 2 moons. Premise 2, Mars has exactly 37 moons. I don't have enough fingers for that. Conclusion, Tilburg is in California. Valid, invalid. What do we think? Hands up, hands down. Not many fingers, some people sitting on their hands. Why? It's a 50-50 shot, guys. Give it a chance. What do we think? Okay, here's the crazy stuff. This one is valid. Now, why is it valid? So, she said, it's impossible for all the premises to be true. Notice, what's funny about 1 and 2 here? If 1 is true, what's truth value for 2? Yeah, 2's got to be false, right? Can't be true. Similarly, if 2 is true, how about 1? What's the truth value for 1? If 2 is true, what's the truth value for sentence 1? False. It's got to be false, right? So 1 and 2 are mutually exclusive. If one's on, the other's off, and vice versa. So there's no way to make all the premises true. Everybody see that? Now, remember, what was the definition of validity again?
It's valid. It's impossible for both premises to be true, but the conclusion to be false.
Good. So, gotta be careful. We want to say all, because there could be more than just 2 premises, right? So again, definition of validity, impossible for all the premises to be true, and the conclusion false. Well, hey, if it's impossible for all the premises to be true together, then it's also impossible for all of them to be true together and the conclusion false. Try and do one impossible thing and have an egg at the same time. You ain't gonna be doing that. And it's not because you can't eat the egg. Do we see the line here? It's beautiful. It's beautiful. Now, I want to highlight this for something really cool. A couple of really cool things. First, the notion of validity that we're after is a little weird. It is a rough and ready approximation, a formalization, an abstraction of this notion of follows from. It's a rough tool, but it is a very effective tool. I want to show you that right off the bat here, with this kind of funny, weird argument. The second really cool thing I want to highlight, and we've already hit it once with thinking about the number of premises in an argument, is that a lot of the things that I want to push you to think about here are going to be edge cases, limit cases. What happens when we push the rules as far as they will let us go? This is a very useful thing if we're logicians, if we're mathematicians, if we're, say, interested in programming up machine learning tools. Let's think about the consequences of these rules all the way to the end. This is one of the secret skills I'm supposed to be teaching you here. Not supposed to, but I want to teach you. But okay, enough little peeking behind the curtain there. This argument is valid. Weird, but it is. Because it's impossible for all the premises to be true and the conclusion false. So validity is going to be our big stalking horse. This is the concept we're going to be tracking and trying to capture in various different ways. We've already sort of seen, it's a little bit funny, but it is a wonderful, wonderful notion. So, that's validity. Now, of course, and I imagine many of you are thinking like, what the fuck? Why would we be interested in this weird tool? I want to know cases where the argument isn't just valid, but the premises are actually true. I'm interested in things being actually true. Fair point. One thing to note here is a lot of times you'll be in situations where you need to evaluate an argument, but you are not prepared to know whether the premises are in fact true or false. You just want to know, hey, were the premises true? Would I get to this result? Because you might be in epistemic uncertainty about the truth of the premises. This is why validity is much more useful. But of course, I can give you another notion. So here's a second definition, a second notion. We won't talk about this nearly as much. But we can say that an argument is sound if and only if it's valid and all its premises are true. So there's some interesting questions to kind of think about the conceptual relationship between these two. But one we can just quickly talk about is, okay, given the definition of soundness, what is the truth value of the conclusion of any sound argument? So take any sound argument. Think about its conclusion. Is the conclusion going to be true or false? Or do we need to know more? Why?
True is if the conclusion is true, or the inference have to be true, so next sound.
Right? So the conclusion of a sound argument is always true. It is always true. Why? Well, a sound argument is valid. So whenever the premises are all true, the conclusion is too. And the premises are all true. Bang, bang. Conclusion must be true. It's the two definitions working together. Do we see the line? Nice. Nice. Okay. So again, I'm throwing this stuff at you relatively quickly. We're going to talk more about it in the tutorials, things like this. So don't stress if it's not quite clicking yet. We've got a long semester ahead of us anyway. So let's finally get to my topic, right? What the hell is logic? Logic is the science of valid reasoning. It's concerned with settling whether an argument's valid or invalid and tracking notions related to validity down. And why validity? Why care about validity rather than, say, soundness or something like this? Well, because discovering that an argument's valid guarantees that the conclusion follows from the premises, which might be the best that you can do given the circumstances you're in. You might not be able to know whether premises are true or false, but you will know what follows from what. This is why we care about validity. One major motivation for studying logic is it's useful for clarifying when arguments are good or bad, regardless of whether we know the premises are true or false. It's great for people like me who don't want to get out of their armchair. Let the empirical people do their work. I've got my little maths formulas to play around with. I'll just sit here, thank you very much. I like that. I'll take that any day of the week. So that's logic. And what we're going to be doing here is a particular version of it called formal logic. Formal logic works by employing what we'll call a formal language. It strips away irrelevant material, laying bare argument structure. It helps us track validity in these related notions. Because frankly, doing this stuff in a natural language like English gets messy. Maths is pure and clear, so we're going to develop a language that's pure and clear along the same lines. A language specifically designed to help us think about validity. In fact, we're going to talk about two. So a formal language is a language, shockingly, with a very precise syntax and a very precise semantics designed for use in very specific situations where natural language is unsuitable. You've already kind of encountered things that aren't too far away from formal languages if you've done any programming at all. Programming languages are immediately adjacent to formal languages. In fact, if you know arithmetic, you already have run into something that's very much like a formal language. Just think of the numerals. So what we're going to do in this course is learn two formal languages. We're going to start off by learning what we'll call truth functional logic. And then we're going to use that as a springboard to get to what we'll call first order logic, or TFL and FOL. Together, they're often thought of as something like classical logic. And these are formal languages. They're tools designed to make it easier to assess things like validity and things like that. So that's the kind of what the hell are we going to be doing? Why do it? Well, hey, there's philosophical interest. This is just kind of fun. It's cool. It's always really good to know whether an argument's good or bad. There's also intrinsic things. Hey, this is just cool. This is neat stuff. It's fun. Possibly more interesting for you guys, there's a whole lot of functionality here. Who's heard of logic gates? Have you run into that sort of stuff before in programming? Logic gates are derived from some operations that we're going to be talking about. We came first. Shockingly. But there's also a whole range of applications that we can do. Hey, look at that big paragraph that I copy-pasted from Wikipedia into the middle of the slides. And there's a range of applications in linguistics and mathematics and where I come from, philosophy. But I'm really more interested in kind of the top two. My focus in this class, what I'm going to try and do is just teach you how to use these tools. The real aim is going to be almost delivering something like know-how, skills. We'll occasionally talk about how you can use it in other places. The fun stuff is that will just sort of happen naturally. So that's the kind of sales pitch. What's the central topic and why is it interesting? Before we truck on, just how are people doing? Feeling okay? Interested? Got a clear notion of what's the definition of validity again? Beautiful. I love it. Again, first question on the midterm, first question on the final exam. If you write that down, hey, there's a point right there. All right. So how are we doing for time? Yeah, okay. So I'm going to go ahead and get started on the second section here. We'll go for about 15, 20 more minutes and then take our break, okay? Cool. So the second section here, what I really want to do is kind of clear some ground just to make explicit some background assumptions we're going to make, to pull apart some things that might just cause some noise. Oh, come on, buddy. There we go. So first thing I want to do is distinguish between three different types of arguments that you may or may not have heard of. So here's a first kind of argument. We'll call them a deductive argument. This is our first column on the left there. Right. Bilbo lives in Bag End. Bilbo is a hobbit, therefore a hobbit lives in Bag End. This is the same kind of thing that we've just seen, right? Every argument we've seen so far has been what we'll call a deductive argument. Contrast that with our middle case, an inductive argument. An inductive argument is broadly a generalization from specific instances. So 99 days ago, I dropped this clicker and it fell to the ground. 98 days ago, I dropped the clicker. Blah, 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 blah. Yesterday, I dropped the clicker, it fell to the ground. Therefore, I'm going to drop it now and it's going to fall to the ground. I'm using past instances to make predictions about future occurrences. Or I might say, every time I drop the clicker, it falls to the ground. This would be generalizing from specific instances. Induction is often used in empirical science. We have a bunch of data, and from this data, we make predictions about future outcomes or generalizations about all outcomes. Familiar? Yes?
Are inductive arguments valid?
Good question. We're going to talk about that next slide. But I love it. I love it. Short answer, sometimes. Not always. And our third type of argument is abductive arguments, or sometimes called inferences to the best explanations. So here's an example. It's easier to kind of get a run up to this so you can see it. So premise one, Bill and Ted had a falling out last week and aren't speaking to each other. Premise two, this morning I saw them jamming in their garage. So conclusion, Bill and Ted must have made up at some point over the last week. They must be friends again. So the structure of these kinds of arguments are, hey, here are some observations, and the conclusion is the best explanation for the premise's truth. The differences here are kind of subtle. But again, note that this deductive argument is in some sense designed to guarantee the truth of the conclusion from the premises. Inductive arguments give us more. We start with something from these premises and somehow we end up with something that's more substantive, something new, a prediction, a generalization. And abductive arguments give us an explanation for all the data that we've collected so far. So you often hear like Sherlock Holmes used deduction. That's full of shit. Sherlock never deduced anything in his fucking life, right? Sherlock only ever used abduction. He used inference to best explanation. He would take up a bunch of information and then say, this must be what happened. It's paradigmatic abduction. So now, to come back to your question, right? These three type of arguments, how do they fare when we think about validity? Well, put really roughly, deductive arguments, valid deductive arguments, necessarily express unbreakable connections between the truth of premises and the truth of conclusions. That's in effect what it is to be a good deductive argument, is to be valid. Good inductive and abductive arguments don't necessarily meet that requirement. You can have a really good inductive argument and it will still fail to be valid. You would have a lot of evidence that really, really pushes you to think, look, it's really likely the conclusion's true. But that's not going to be enough to guarantee validity. Similarly, with abduction. Many really good abductive arguments are still not necessarily valid. Here is the best explanation. But it turns out that the real explanation is some gerrymandered bullshit. That's always on the table. It's possible when we think about inductive and abductive arguments, not always, but 99.9% of the time, to make the premises true and the conclusion false. The standards for goodness and badness in inductive and abductive arguments is different. Here's a good inductive argument that the conclusion didn't work out so well. Got to remember to point the clicker over here. I'm not going to read it. It's kind of gross. Happy Thanksgiving. So again, good inductive argument, not such a happy result. So, all we're really trying to point out here isn't to denigrate or undercut the value of inductive arguments or the value of abductive arguments. It's just to say the standards of goodness for these is different than the notion of validity. In this course, what we're going to do is only look at deductive arguments. We're just going to be tracking this notion of validity, so we're only interested in deductive arguments. In other courses, you're going to talk about inductive and abductive. In fact, I think that's what you're going to talk about quite a bit with Michael. So that's just to kind of do some clarification. We're not going to be thinking about generalizing from empirical evidence. We're not going to be thinking about inferences to the best explanation. We are only looking for that airtight connection between truth of premises, truth of conclusions. That's the first little bit of ground clearing. The second little bit of ground clearing has to do with the kinds of things that can serve as premises and conclusions. So, when we think about the types of sentences that there can be lots and lots of different types of sentences. No worries. In particular, we can mark a distinction between what we'll call assertoric and non-assertoric sentences. Assertoric sentences assert. They make claims. Claims that can be true or false. Non-assertoric sentences do not assert. They make no claims that can be assessed for truth or falsity. There's lots of different kinds of non-assertoric sentences. Questions are non-assertoric. Can you get this round? There's not really a sense where the question itself is true or false. An answer to the question might be true or false, but it's almost a mistake to say the question is true or false. Similarly, imperatives, commands, aren't really truth or valuable. If I say, hey, buy the next round, you can conform to it or not, obey or not, but that's not really making the command true or false. And similarly, exclamations. Yeah.
Is it an imperative if you tell someone you're buying the next round?
Yeah, so that's a command, right? So an imperative is basically like telling them.
But
Now,
you can also call it true or false.
good. So one of the things we can note here is that you can have the same action and it fall in multiple different kinds of readings here. We could read the you're buying the next round in an assertoric way, where it's a prediction about what's going to happen next. Then it's truth or value. But if I say you're buying the next round, right, as in go do it, then it's not assertoric anymore. It's an imperative. I'm commanding. It can be obeyed or not obeyed. So this is nice. It's a good point. Did everyone, could people hear him? So the case was basically, if we think about you're buying the next round. You can read that in a kind of assertive or non-assertive way. But it already kind of drives home the idea, right? When we're thinking about the sorts of things that can be premises or conclusions, it's got to be apt for truth. It's got to be apt for truth or falsity. So commands in non-assertoric readings were both. Put another way, you can't use them. Did you see what I did? That was good. That was a good joke. Come on. So exclamations, similarly, don't go. The only ones that can come in here are sentences that aim to state facts. State something. They make an assertion. This is really just ground clearing. Again, it means that there's some sentences we're never going to be able to capture because they're just not really in the kind of game of thinking about validity. Questions won't enter into the mix here because they're just not what our machinery can deal with. Similarly, some more ground clearing. We're going to operate with some simplifying assumptions for our machinery, our logic machinery to work. First assumption is we're going to assume that there are only two truth values and that they're opposites. We have truth and we have falsity. Other logics, in fact, we'll talk a little bit about this at the very, very end of the course. Other logics allow for more. You might allow for gradations of truth. But we're going to start off with just this binary on or off. That's going to turn out to be hard enough. And similarly, along with this first assumption of there only being true and false, the two truth values, we're going to make some assumptions about the way they interact. We're going to assume that there are no truth value gaps and there are no truth value gluts. So what do we mean by that? No gaps means every sentence is true or false. Every assertoric sentence is going to have a truth value, and it's going to be one of our two. There's no gaps in the truth value space. So the easiest way to kind of get a grip on this is if you think about fiction. Fiction is typically thought to be gappy. Right? Is it true that Sherlock Holmes has a mole on his left shoulder? I mean, the story doesn't really say yes, and the story doesn't really say no. It just seems like the story doesn't say anything at all about it in any way. Is it true that I have a mole on my left shoulder? Well, look, you might epistemically be in the dark about that, but there is a fact of the matter. The world settles whether I do or I don't. The fiction's gappy. The world, at least on our assumptions, is not. Every assertoric sentence is going to be either true or false. Cool? Again, simplifying assumptions. And our last simplifying assumption, there's no gluts. What does this mean? Everybody know that the idea of gluttony? Having too much? So, a truth value glut is where a sentence has multiple truth values. So in this case, it means that no sentence is both true and false. So again, no gluts means no sentence is both true and false at the same time in the same respect. No gaps and no gluts basically forces us into this idea that, look, the space of all the assertoric sentences divides into the true sentences and the false sentences, and they're exhaustive and exclusive. If you're in one group, you're not in the other. And everybody's in one of the two. Again, clear? Makes sense? These are all simplifying. We can have more complicated logics that let you blur these things in. So we're going to start with this because, hey, we've got to start walking before we start running. Okay. Why don't we take our... Yeah, good. Okay. Before we dive into the rest of it, I think we should take our little break here. So by my clock, it's 11:31. We'll come back at 42, so 10 minutes, give or take. Sounds good? See you back in 10 minutes.